When it comes to representing landscapes and natural scenery, there are a few contextualizing features that one needs to understand, and these can be utilized in a way to enhance the overall artwork and also be used strategically to push forward the concept of scale and depth to create more space within the environment. And these contextualizing features can include things such as trees, rocks, certain organic features that you would find in your environment, but perhaps one of the most essential and the most seemingly complicated is that of how to represent clouds. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art related topics. And in today's tutorial, we will be breaking down the process of how to represent clouds through the watercolor medium. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now, clouds are very interesting in the sense that they are quite abstract as a structure, which actually gives us a lot of freedom to kind of play around with how we form our clouds. However, there are many ways to paint clouds, but in this particular tutorial, we will be working with a very particular method where we kind of pull paint away from the page to develop a more realistic sense of cloud formation and to capture a more airy-like quality in terms of the outline and formation of the cloud. Now, what we will be using is basically some tissue paper or some toilet paper, whatever you'd like to call it. And as we go through this process of painting our watercolor clouds, we really want to make sure that we are working quite fast. So this tutorial is going to show you how to kind of use a reductive process of lifting paint off of the page or the surface area that you're working on. And as we kind of create this watercolor sky, this technique is a very common way of making watercolor clouds, and we'll find that it's quite useful and very fun, in fact, because we can simply create these negative spaces in various shapes. Now, the way in which we start is when learning how to paint clouds in watercolor, we want to go about it through a layering process. So we do this by creating the sky first, which we can only do on a well water primed surface. So let's go ahead and put a thin layer of water on the surface of our paper and prime the paper. By painting a watercolor sky, it can be done so with freedom of color choice, as skies are often very abstract in the sense that sunsets can have various colors, so you can play around with the color variation of your sky, and that's really up to you. However, we do want to work whilst the page is still wet, applying colors, making these long side-to-side strokes along our page with a fairly large brush. As you make the strokes from one side of the page to the other, you want to make sure that the page is still wet as we add in these colors. Again, like I suggested, we will be working quite swiftly in this particular case, and this will create a little bit more of a seamless gradient between the transitions and colors of your sky. So we want to keep the making of the strokes and the colors on a wet surface, and making sure that that wet surface remains wet as we apply these various colors. And as aforementioned, as we work on this wet surface area, we'll find that as it dries, it will create these more seamless transitions between your color variations in your sky. However, while the page is still wet, we're going to now work with a very hasty process where we proceed by making these dry marks on the wet paper, which will then obviously in turn become the cloud formation. Now, this means we want to develop these marks on our page whilst the page is still wet once again, and we do this by taking some crumpled up paper towels and begin to make these little dab motions on the wet paint. Now, we can also strategically position and mold our paper towel in a way that has a point, and this way we can kind of capture finer edges and allow yourself some finer edges that you would like in terms of creating and shaping your cloud a little more effectively. We can feel free to create different kinds of shapes and sizes where we create these kind of cumulonimbus type shapes or other type shapes. It's really up to you, but this is where we do want to work quite fast. However, remember that you don't want to overwhelm your sky. This way we don't necessarily overwhelm the coloration that we've established in the sky, because we want a good balance between sky and the amount of clouds in the sky. You will find it does take some time to get used to, so allow yourself to trial and error this kind of process with a few preliminary draft paintings where you kind of work out the process. However, remember, we want to act fast whilst the paint is still wet. Another good tip to remember is that different pressures applied to your dabs will also have different effects, so try to keep a light hand in the moments and explore harder pressures in other for a variety of shape and form, and we should be left with a variation of clouds that depict some kind of scenario in the sky. A good suggestion as well is to also stop when you feel there is a good ratio of clouds to sky, and again, this is where we want to think about not overwhelming the landscape with too many clouds. Now, again, clouds are a contextualizing feature, which means that we still want to integrate the rest rest of the landscape, and this is obviously a subjective choice as we are more focused on the process of creating clouds. This is basically where we can start playing around with how we kind of create a landscape to further contextualize the overall scenario, and it helps us understand how the clouds kind of fit into an actual landscape, so we can continue to paint. In this case, let's use yellow in the foreground of our painting towards the center of the page until we have made a horizon line, let's say at the height that we are satisfied with. Another good suggestion is to perhaps give some sort of hints to mountains in the distance by painting some little pointed tips along the horizon, and as we continue we can then allow that to dry, and then we can proceed by painting the darker tonal values of the landscape. If you'd like to give your landscape some concept of depth, you can always paint some darker tones in the foreground over the layer of yellow. And again, another way to kind of think about creating depth is to keep the tonal values dark in the foreground, so you can kind of establish these lighter tonal values that will represent basically this concept of structures in the distance, and then painting over them with some darker features or darker tonal values in those features in the foreground will represent a quality of depth. However, try to keep your darkest marks towards the bottom of the page. By doing so, that quality of depth of the landscape will seem a little bit more viable and a little bit more realistic. Otherwise, guys, that is the general process of how to paint clouds. Really fun, really simple, and a really useful skill to have, especially in the case of the watercolor medium. And this just helps you to kind of create more realistic clouds because of the crumpled paper towel quality. It kind of pulls paint in a way that is a lot more unpredictable and sporadic than that of a brush, and this is why we utilize this secondary tool in tandem with the watercolor medium for an effective representation of clouds. But otherwise, some key things to think about: establish the sky as the most some key things to think about is you want to build up your landscape with layers. So the sky always tends to be the furthest structure or scenario, so you want to establish that first, and you want to work whilst the page is still wet to establish these transitions of colors in the sky, as well as create these marks that you pull paints off of with your paper towel. So obviously you need the surface area of the page to be wet whilst you do that, and you want to work quite quick. Also, don't overwhelm the sky with too many clouds. Think about scale and how large or how small the clouds can be in terms of effectively representing a sense of scale. And then lastly, contextualize the scene further. Obviously this is subjective, but that's how you represent the landscape and how the clouds work in that particular landscape. If you did like this video and are interested in similar or related topics looking into representing organic materials and structures and features, let us know in the comment section below, and please show your support by liking and subscribing. This helps us to grow this channel. We are still small, we love making art content, but your support is really what's going to enable us to carry on. But otherwise, guys, thanks again for tuning in. That is it from me today. Please do like and subscribe. See you in the next video. Cheers.